Good morning. Welcome back. Short week, 2 days. I just got back from a walk. It's Sunday night, and I got a hat hair. But we last left them. They had Will had his encounter with Bryn, Jerome, and Alda, and Halt was there. So I remember they got kicked out. So, anyways, chapter 23. In the weeks following his final encounter with the three bullies, Horace noticed a definite change in life at the battle school. The most important factor, I already read this. Oh yeah, he was going to thank them. Sorry, I only read the first couple paragraphs of this chapter. Here we go. Will and Halt are heading to the Ranger Gathering, which is the meeting with all 50 Rangers from the entire kingdom. Are we nearly there? Will asked for perhaps the 10th time that morning. Halt gave vent to a small sigh of exasperation. Other than that, he made no reply. They had been on the road now for 3 days, and it seemed to Will that they must be close to the gathering ground. Several times in the past hour he had noticed an unfamiliar scent in the air. He mentioned it to Halt, who said briefly, "It's salt. We're getting close to the sea," then refused to elaborate any further. Will glanced sidelong at his teacher, hoping that perhaps Halt might deign to share a little more information with him, but the ranger's keen eyes were scanning the ground in front of them. From time to time, Will noticed he looked up into the trees that flanked the road. "Are you looking for something?" Will asked, and Halt turned in his saddle. "Finally, a useful question," he said. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. The chief ranger will have sentries out around the gathering ground. I always like to try to fool them as I'm approaching." "Why?" asked Will, and Halt allowed himself a tight little grin. "It keeps them on their toes," he explained. "They'll try to slip behind us and follow us in, just as so they can say they've ambushed me. It's a silly game they like to play." "Why is it silly?" asked Will. It sounded exactly like the sort of skill exercises that he and Halt had practiced regularly. The grizzled ranger turned in his saddle and fixed Will with an unblinking stare. "Because they never succeed," he said. "And this year they'll be trying even harder because they know I'm bringing an apprentice. They'll want to see how good you are." "Is this part of the testing?" Will asked, and Halt nodded. "It's the start of it. Do you remember what I told you last night?" Will nodded. For the past 2 nights, around the campfire, Halt's soft voice had given Will advice and instruction on how to conduct himself at the gathering. Last night, they devised tactics for use in case of an ambush, just the sort of thing that Halt had mentioned now. "When will we—" he began, but suddenly Halt was alert. He held up a warning finger for silence, and Will stopped speaking instantly. The ranger's head was turned slightly to listen. The 2 horses continued without hesitation. "Hear it?" Halt asked. Will craned his head, too. He thought that just maybe he could hear some hoofbeats behind them, but he wasn't sure. The gait of their own horses masked any real sound from the trail behind. If there was someone there, his horse was moving in step with their own. "Change gait," Halt whispered. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Simultaneously, they both nudged their left toes into the horses' shoulders. It was just one of many signals to which Tug and Abelard were trained to respond. Instantly, both horses hesitated in their stride. They seemed to skip a pace, and then continued in their even gait. But the hesitation had changed the pattern of their hoofbeats, and for an instant Will could hear another set of horses' hooves behind them, like a slightly delayed echo. Then the other horse changed gait as well to match their own, and the sound was gone. "Ranger horse," Halt said softly. "It'll be Galan for sure." "How can you tell?" Will asked. "Only a ranger horse could change his pace as quickly as that. And it'll be Galan because it's always Galan. He loves trying to catch me out." "Why?" asked Will, and Halt looked sternly at him. "Because he was my last apprentice," he explained, "and for some reason, former apprentices just love to catch their former masters with their breeches down." He looked accusingly at his own current apprentice. Will was about to protest that he would never behave in such a fashion after he graduated, then realized that he probably would, and at the very first opportunity. The protest died unspoken. Halt signaled for silence and scanned the trail ahead of them. Then he pointed. "That's the spot there," he said. "Ready?" There was a large tree close to the side of the trail with branches hanging out just above head height. Will studied it for a moment, then nodded. Tug and Abelard continued their even pacing toward the tree. As they came closer, Will kicked his feet from the stirrups and rose to stand, crouching on Tug's back. The horse didn't vary his pace as his master shifted position. As they passed under the branches, Will reached up and seized the lowest one, swinging himself up into it. The instant his weight had left Tug's back, the little horse began to pace more vigorously, forcing his hooves into the ground with each step so that there would be no sign to a tracker behind them that his load had suddenly lightened. Silently, Will climbed higher into the tree until he found a spot where he had solid perch and a clear view. He could see Halt and the two horses moving slowly down the trail. As they reached the next bend, Halt urged Tug to keep going, then halted Abelard and swung down from the saddle. He dropped to his knees, seeming to study the ground for signs of tracks. Now, Will could hear the other horse behind them. He looked back the way they had come, but another bend hid their follower from sight. Then the soft hoofbeats ceased. Will's mouth was dry and his heart beat faster and faster inside his rib cage. He was sure the sound must be audible to anyone within 50 meters or so. But his training asserted itself, and he stood motionless on the tree branch among the leaves and dappled shadows, watching the trail behind them. A movement. He saw it from the corner of his eye, then it was gone. He peered closely at the spot for a second or two, and then remembered Halt's lesson. Don't focus your attention on one spot. Keep a wide focus all the time and keep scanning. You'll see him as a movement, not as a figure. Remember, he's a ranger too, and he's been trained in the art of not being seen. Will widened his focus and scanned the forest behind them. Within seconds, he was rewarded by another sign of movement. A branch swung back into place as an unseen figure passed silently by. Then, 10 meters farther on, a bush swayed slightly. Then he saw a clump of tall grass springing slowly back into position from where a passing foot had crushed it momentarily. Will stayed stock still. He marveled at the fact that their pursuer could move through the forest without his seeing them. Obviously, the other ranger had left his horse behind and was stalking Halt on foot. Will's eyes swiveled for a quick glance at Halt. His teacher still seemed to be preoccupied with some sign on the ground. Another movement came from the forest. The unseen ranger had passed Will's hiding place now and was moving back toward the trail, intent on surprising Halt from behind. Suddenly, a tall figure in a gray-green cloak seemed to rise out of the ground in the middle of the trail, some 20 meters behind the kneeling figure of Halt. Will blinked. One moment the figure hadn't been there. Next, he seemed to materialize out of thin air. Will's hand began to move toward the quiver of arrows slung over his back. Then he halted the movement. Halt had told him the night before. Wait until we're talking. If he's not talking, he'll hear the slightest movement you make. Will gulped, hoping that the tall figure hadn't heard the movement of his hand toward the quiver. But it seemed that he had stopped in time. Below him, he heard a cheerful voice call out, Halt! Halt! Halt turned and rose slowly to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees as he rose. He put his head on one side and studied the figure in the middle of the trail, who was leaning easily on a longbow identical to Halt's own. Well, Galan, he called. I see you're still making that old joke. The tall ranger shrugged and replied cheerfully, The joke appears to be on you this year, Halt. As Galan spoke, Will's hand moved quickly but quietly to his quiver, and he selected an arrow, laying it ready on the bowstring. Halt was speaking again now. Really, Galan? And what joke would that be, I wonder? The amusement was evident in Galan's voice as he replied to his old master. Come now, Halt, admit it. For once I've got the best of you, and you know how many years I've been trying. Halt rubbed one hand over his grizzled beard thoughtfully. It beats me why you keep on trying, Galan, as a matter of fact. Galan laughed. You should know how much pleasure it gives an ex-apprentice to get the better of his master, Halt. Now come on, admit it. This year I've won. As the tall figure spoke, Will carefully drew back the arrow, sighting on a tree trunk some 2 meters to Galan's left. Halt's instructions echoed in his ears. Choose a target close enough to startle him when he shoot, but for pity's sake, not too close. If he moves, I don't want you putting an arrow through him. Halt hadn't moved from his position in the center of the trail. Galan was now shifting his weight uneasily from one foot to another. Halt's unperturbed manner was beginning to bother him. It appeared that all of a sudden he wasn't totally sure that Halt was merely trying to bluff his way out of the trap. Halt's next words added to his suspicions. Ah, yes, Apprentices and masters. They're a strange combination, all right. But tell me, Galan, my old apprentice, aren't you forgetting something this year? Perhaps it was the way Halt had laid a little extra stress on the word apprentice, but suddenly Galan became aware that he had made a mistake. His head began to turn, searching for the apprentice that he had forgotten. And as he began the movement, Will released his arrow. The shaft hissed through the air past the tall ranger and thudded, quivering into the tree that Will had selected. Galan jerked back with shock. Then his eyes swung into the branches of the tree where Will stood concealed. Will marveled that, even caught by surprise as he was, Galan was able to react so quickly in identifying the direction from which his attacker had shot. Galan shook his head ruefully. His keen eyes could make out the small gray and green-clad figure concealed in the shadows of the tree's foliage. "Come down, Will," Halt called, "and meet Galan, one of our more careless rangers." He shook his head at Galan. "I told you when you were a boy, didn't I? Never be too hasty. Don't rush into things." Galan nodded, somewhat crestfallen. He looked even more so when Will dropped to the ground from the lowest branch, and the tall ranger saw how small and young the apprentice was. "It appears," he said, "that I was so intent on catching myself an old gray fox that I overlooked the small monkey hiding in the trees." He grinned at his own remark. "Monkey, is it?" Halt said gruffly. I'd say he's made a monkey out of you today. Will, this is Galan, my former apprentice, and now ranger of Merrick Fife, although what they did to deserve him is beyond me." Galan's grin widened, and he held out his hand to Will. "And just as I was thinking I'd finally get the better of you, Halt," he said cheerfully. "So you're Will," he continued, shaking hands firmly. "I'm pleased to meet you. That was a neat piece of work, young fellow." Will grinned at Halt, and the older ranger made a slight, meaningful movement of his head. Will remembered the final instructions that Halt had given him the night before. "Once you best a man, never gloat. Be generous and find something in his actions to praise. He won't enjoy being bested, but he'll make a good face of it. Show him you appreciate it. Praise can win you a friend. Gloating will only ever make enemies." "Yes, Will, I am. Sorry. Yes, I'm Will," he said. And then he added, "Could you perhaps teach me how you move like that? It was brilliant." Galan laughed ruefully. "Not too brilliant, I think. You obviously saw me coming from a long way away." Will shook his head, remembering how hard he had tried to spot Galan. Now he thought of it, his praise and his request were more genuine than he had realized. "I saw you when you arrived," he said, "and I saw you where you had been. But I never once saw you from the time you rounded that bend. I wish I could move like that." Galan's face showed his pleasure at Will's obvious sincerity. "Well, Halt," he said, "I see this young fellow doesn't merely have talent, he has excellent manners as well." Halt regarded the two of them, his current apprentice and his former student. He nodded to Will, approving his tactful words. "Unseen movement was always Galan's best skill," he said. "You'd do well if he agreed to tour you." He moved toward his ex-apprentice and placed his arm around the taller man's shoulders. "It's good to see you again." They embraced each other warmly. Then Halt held the other man at arm's length, studying him carefully. You get lankier every year," he said finally. "When are you going to put some meat on your bones?" Galan smiled. It was obviously an old joke between them. "You appear to have enough for both of us," he said. He poked Halt in the ribs, none too gently. "Is that the beginning of a potbelly I see there?" He grinned at Will. "I'll wager he's sitting around the cabin letting you do all the housework these days." Before Halt or Will could reply, he turned away and he let out a whistle. A few seconds later, his horse trotted around the bend in the road. As the tall young ranger moved toward his horse and unmounted, Will noticed a sword hanging in a scabbard from the saddle. He turned to Halt, puzzled. "I thought we weren't allowed to have swords," he said quietly. Halt frowned for a moment, not understanding, and then followed Will's gaze and realized what had prompted the question. "It's not that we're not allowed," he explained as they both mounted. "It's a matter of priorities. It takes years to become a good swordsman, and we don't have the time. We have other skills to develop." He saw the next question forming on Will's lips and went on. "Galan's father is a knight, so Galan had already been training with the sword for some years before he joined the Rangers. He was considered a special case, and he was allowed to continue that training when he was apprenticed to me. But I thought... Will began and then hesitated. Galan was trotting his horse toward them, and he wasn't sure if he would be polite to ask his next question in front of him. Never say that in front of Halt, Galan said, overhearing Will's last words. He'll simply reply, You're an apprentice, you're not ready to think. Or, if you thought about it, you wouldn't ask. Will had to smile. Halt had used those exact words on him on more than one occasion, and Galan's impersonation of the older ranger was uncanny. Now, however, both men were looking expectantly at him, waiting to hear the question he had been about to ask. So he plunged ahead. If Galan's father was a knight, wasn't he automatically eligible for battle school? Or did they think he was too small as well? Halt and Galan exchanged a look. Halt raised one eyebrow and then gestured for Galan to reply. I could have gone to battle school, he said, but I chose to join the Rangers. Some of us do, you know, Halt put in mildly. Will thought this over. He had always assumed that the Rangers did not come from the ranks of the kingdom's nobles. Apparently, he was wrong. But I thought... He began and instantly realized his mistake. Halt and Galan looked at him, then looked at each other and said in chorus, You're an apprentice. You're not ready to think. Then they wheeled their horses and trotted off. Will hurriedly retrieved Tug and cantered after them. As he caught up, the two rangers edged their horses to either side, allowing him space to ride between them. Galan grinned once at him. Halt was as grim as ever, but as they continued in a companionable silence, Will became aware of the comforting realization that he was now part of an exclusive, tightly knit group. It was a warm sense of belonging, as if somehow he had arrived home for the first time in his life. Okie dokie. That's it for today, I think. Have a good day.